am looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be looking at a topic around unlocking the true potential of leaders, teams, and organisations, which is a worthy pursuit and I think has kind of equal parts inspiration and hard work that emerge when you kind of think of that topic. And it's one of the things that we're going to talk about today with our guest. So welcome to the Jasper Blueprint podcast. Today, I'm joined by Paul Crick, the founder of the Elevate Partnership. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Bessi. This is great.
I'll give a little bit of background for people joining us around yourself, but feel free to then jump in if I've missed anything or you want to add anything into the mix. Okay. So a little bit of background for Paul. Paul is a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 and Times 250 corporations, public sector institutions, and voluntary organisations. Driven by a profound belief in authenticity and self-investment, Paul guides his clients towards embracing their unique identity and purpose, empowering them to make a meaningful impact on the world. I'm really keen to see where our conversation goes today, Paul. Happy to kind of let it flow, go wherever it needs to go. Supporting and equipping leaders is something that both of us take very seriously and, have a sense of calling, I suppose, to work with people in that space. But when our mutual friend Dave introduced us, the first piece of yours that I read spoke about what you call uncommon conversations and how they drive team performance. And I'm wondering if you can kick us off kind of exploring and running through what is an uncommon conversation and why do you think they're important for us as leaders? Feel free to kind of weave in some of your background in that, but I'm curious to sort of start with that.
Starting with the background. So I'm a recovering management consultant. I did that for 20 years, so don't hold that against me. But I had a great time learning about commerce in a number of different guises all around the world. And what I noticed was, whilst organizations may be different and there may be some cultural nuances and approaches in different geographies, human beings are basically human beings. Broadly speaking, at a certain level, there is as much commonality as there is difference. So I think that's the start point. I think then the other thing I'd add into the mix is I was lucky enough to be invited to do a TEDx talk in 2019. And then I've always been interested in the idea of becoming yourself. Who are we really, and what influences how we show up and how people perceive that, certainly through my own journey. Certain things that in my past that I look back now and I go, no, but it's all part of the journey. And I'd read a piece as I was researching, published by Forbes magazine in 2019, that said, globally we were spending $366 billion on training leaders, to which my instant reaction was, yeah, and look where we are. There's something not quite working here. And I was curious to figure out why, and to see if in some way, shape or form I could influence in some small way changing that. And a lot of it comes down to the language we use. I firmly believe that language shapes how we interact with each other. Language is imprecise, and yet we use it to make meaning, to create understanding, and to share ideas, feelings, concepts with others. And our language is often shaped by how we are conditioned. And we don't explore that in enough depth, to my mind, to really think about what it is we're saying, what's the impact of that on another person at a neurobiological level. Because we have this thing that we're constantly sweeping the environment. It's called neuroception, comes out of polyvagal theory, which I'm sure you're aware of, that says, am I safe? Am I safe in this environment? It is literally that simple. And the language we use either engages, it creates a sensation inside of us that then causes us to go, where have I had this before? We do a search in our memory. We come back with that with a number of different things. And we either go, this was okay, this was not okay, or this is something new, I've not experienced it. And we have this, I'm talking very bluntly, because it's much more nuanced and complex than
Of
that.
course.
But essentially, we get to the point: am I safe? Am I not safe? And depending on that, that depends whether I steel myself up for what's about to happen, whether that's just a simple verbal conversation or something more, or I relax. I ease into my rest and digest system, and I just ease into and become comfortable in relating with others.
And
Makes
obviously,
sense?
it does a real issue for anyone. But when you layer on top of that someone who's in a position where they're leading others, or their own reactions and language choices have flow-on effects for others around them, it kind of ups the importance of being conscious of those and making intentional decisions, not just accidentally, fumbling through things.
And I think that the word intentional is really important, choosing words carefully, not because you necessarily want to be on message, although there are certain circumstances where perhaps that does occur, but because you're thinking about the impact you're having on other people. Are you encouraging them to step out of their comfort zone? Are you getting to them to try on new thinking that perhaps they haven't had before? Because when you do that, you then help that person step into something that they've not experienced before, and therefore, by definition, they grow. And for me, a leader's role is simply to create more leaders. Your job is to help other people, is to help people find the light that lights them up inside themselves, and then help them find ways to amplify that in their professional life and in their wider life, if they can. It's that simple and it's that difficult. Warren Bennis has my favorite definition of leadership, which is such a weasel word, but he said becoming a leader is the same as becoming yourself. It's that easy and it's that difficult, and I love that because it's true.
And that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks of the most important but most difficult task is know thyself. It's like all been around for many thousands of years, hasn't it? That understanding of just the importance and centrality.
And we overcomplicate it. And if we can only bring it back to an acceptance that we are biological animals at the end of the day. Yes, we are human beings, but fundamentally we operate with and I don't like the term operating system because that sort of introduces the idea that we're a computer and we're not. Yeah. We're about as far away from a computer as you can be. But that idea of the psychological and the neurochemical and the neurophysiological processes that all combine together in this huge, complex thing to guide how we choose to make meaning and feel our way through the world, so that if we learn to do that and learn to do it well, then it's almost like, well, this sounds pejorative and I don't mean to do it that way. You're fit to play in the playground with the other kids. How many times have you worked in organizations where you look at things in teams and team dynamics and you go, we're just not playing nice together. And then I'm always curious, so what's the unmet need here that sits behind that behavior?
Well, and because it's interesting, sometimes those exact elements that you discussed have been taken on board and someone's exploring them for themselves as a leader, but they haven't taken that important next step that you discussed of then saying, okay, now it's not just my job to have self-awareness and build up all these particular skills for me, but now to create a platform and inspire and encourage others to also go on that journey. And so I think you can go into any organization and actually need to do a bit of that triage to assess, okay, what layer are we playing at here? Because it's not always just that someone hasn't done the work. Sometimes it just hasn't been translated down. But often, as you said, we're just not playing nice and we haven't actually come back to the fundamentals. Maybe talk to us then a little bit in terms of the work that you've done, the leaders that you've engaged with and organisations you've supported, about some of these elements that help do that personal work, but then translate and create a platform where there is the security and safety.
I'm working with a team now, 14 leaders in a organisation that consists of a number of different businesses, but there's overlaps because you've got central services that serve all of those businesses. You've got other people. There's no cross-pollination of ideas and best practices yet. And they're very courageous because they said, would you come in and help us? And it was like, okay, do you know what you're in for? Because we're gonna look at how you all perceive each other at a one-to-one level. We did a 360 assessment for all 14 leaders and got varying responses. Various people were shocked, angry, surprised, pleased, interested, fascinated by what the data told them in terms of this is how you're perceived.
Yeah. And I'm curious, do you find when you do that kind of exercise, are more people shocked by what others think about them, or when you do assessments, what emerges more in terms of categorizing or explaining them? Like, where is the disconnect?
It's the difference between how they see themselves and how other people sees them, and having that in black and white. And the process we go through is we ask for verbatim feedback. What does this leader do well? And then what is the area, with the one area, or what are the areas for development? And how is this leader challenged, and what would you recommend? And then is there anything else you want to comment on? And we get them to read those verbatim comments out in the debrief. Because when you read something with the voice in your head, you have a very different visceral experience to reading that out to someone else being present and actually being witnessed. It is powerful doing that, because you get reactions from tears, which is just the relief of, I knew all this, and people don't listen. And, just that being seen and being heard, which is beautiful, because there's that frustration finally gets let out, and there's the energy release. It comes in the form of tears, or it comes in the form of anger, and gets expressed. And we're in a confidential and safe environment, so I just go, well, say what needs to be said as you get this, because the data in that. So you're not your profile. What I'm learning is actually it doesn't matter which tool you use. What matters is the conversation that it sparks. That's where the value is. Now, I have a preference for a particular tool because it presents the data in a certain way.
Sure.
It's one of the few tools that looks at the connection between internal assumptions and patterns of thought and how that expresses itself in behavior. I don't see that in other tools yet. It doesn't mean it won't happen.
Are you willing to tell us what that tool is?
It's a bit of promotion. So it's Leadership Circle's 360 assessment. So I use their tool set along with. So it's not the only toolkit, but it's a great place to start from, because you're comparing yourself to an external normative base of 100,000 leaders from around the world.
Yeah.
So you're not comparing yourself with the leaders in your company directly. You're comparing yourself. How do I stack up as a leader compared to other leaders?
More of a benchmark. Yeah. Okay.
And that becomes interesting.
I understand your point that it's not so much the tool. You can use any different tool. It's about the conversations that then happen as a result, or in the sharing and processing that information. But one of the other things, because I'm also a lover of all assessment tools, done many, used a lot of different ones in my work and with my teams over the years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find fascinating is, yes, there's the conversational element, but like anything, what we get out is only as good as what goes in. And I find it fascinating when someone hasn't done the work and isn't incredibly comfortable with the pieces we spoke about before around knowing themselves, being aware, that often they actually struggle to even answer the questions in a genuine way, which means that the information you get out of them at the end of the day isn't then as valuable. How do you work with someone if you sense that hesitation, or in reading their results, you're kind of like, there's a disconnect here. What do we need to do for you to feel that you have the courage to kind of be honest in the way you answer the question? So I'll give you a quick example on that. Mm-hmm. I had someone, a leader once, who I worked with, and we were using a particular tool, and they voiced that they were quite nervous about, well, what if it said they were manipulative? And I was like, interesting. Well, you are. So like, that's probably what it's going to say. So they went through the process, did the assessment. It came back. And then when we were having our conversation going through the results, they were like, look, Bessi, yes, it says I'm not manipulative. And I said, well, that means you're even more manipulative than we thought, because you've answered the questions trying to make it say you're not manipulative. Like it's a silly example, but I'm throwing that in there because part of this richness of what we bring as a leader and our ability to have these conversations and create this space for other leaders really requires us to be comfortable with the parts of ourselves that may not be that pretty.
But isn't that isn't that the way? And isn't that why we do all the work we do? So that we can, as far as we can, be a blank canvas, although we're never a blank canvas, understand what is likely to trigger us, what normally triggers us. I mean, that's the whole purpose of supervision. It's kind of like, that's what I take to my supervisor. I don't let my client know that I've been triggered, but I'll go, or there'll be something that we need to talk about, to work through and think through, because it's the meaning I give it, it's the experiences I draw upon, and then view it through my lens, and that distorts and generalizes what's actually happening in the room. Because so there's the actual truth of the situation, there's my interpretation of that truth and my client's interpretation of that truth, there's the emotions that sit with it, and then there's the lessons that go along with that, which is really what we're trying to uncover. It's kind of like, so what does this teach us together?
And in the way that you support or equip a leader through these processes, through being able to receive that feedback and process it with your colleagues, how do you then walk someone through starting to learn to be able to put that into practice in an interaction with their own team or in an interaction with a client?
What we did alongside for these 14 leaders, we did a litmus test which said, how do you all show up together as a collective? So you had the individuals. So the design of what I was doing was, I said, what we need to do is get to a start line. And on that start line, we all have a view of how we see ourselves individually, how others see us individually, and then how we all see each other collectively showing up versus how we show up today versus how we want to show up, and to look at the gaps. What are the gaps telling us? What was interesting was what I do is I play what look like games, but they always have a covert purpose to them. And one of the games, sometimes it's called a helium stick, sometimes it's called a gravity stick. But you get this team to basically hold a stick with their fingers and lower it to the floor together. Well, I spice that up a little bit, and I have two sticks, and both teams have to get both sticks together on the floor at the same time. It creates all sorts of chaos. And it's the design of the workshop. Again, I'm looking at, what am I taking them through? What do I want people to say? So I got their CEO to stand up and say, what's this all about? Why now? Why this? Why are we doing this? What matters? What's important? And it was, some of the language was interesting, because we say, well, we can be as good as any of the global players in the markets that we've chosen and the businesses that we've chosen to operate. That's great. The words global domination was used, and I let that pass, because I thought there's no value in me picking people up on that language at this point in the process. So it's like, okay, global domination. Anyway, we started this game, and we got this team of 14, two lines of 7 opposite each other, two sticks. And the idea was they basically lowered the sticks so they all hit the floor at the same time, slowly, gently, and it was timed. And we got to almost 6 minutes, and they were still talking. They still held the sticks at chest high, and they were still talking and arguing as to how best to do it. Which, when you stop people and you go, pause, let's look at what's going on here. Who's doing what? What's causing people to choose to do this? Why is the stick going up when it's supposed to be going down? All those things, people not talking. Oh, when you said you did that, I thought you wanted me to do that. Why are the tall people at this end and the small people are in the middle? Wouldn't it make sense to do things the other way around? So you get all these conversations going on, and you go, I bet this turns up in your normal interactions. And they kind of looked at me, and I said, you've spent almost 6 minutes and you've not managed to lower the stick together to the floor, and you're seeking global domination. I think you might be a little ways from that. And someone went, oh, that's a bit harsh. And I went, possibly, but it's also fact. And then we did it again. And this is right. That kind of thing where you sort of puff your chest out. It's like, right, I'll show you, you stupid facilitator. We can work together. And they got the stick to the floor in 3 minutes and 32 seconds. And you just go, right, that's the uncommon conversation we need to have in organizations. Because the challenge we have at the moment is we'll do performance conversations or career conversations, and they're always in private, they're always confidential, and they're always one-to-one, usually, and behind closed doors. So what chance have we actually got of actually getting teams in a room to have that uncommon conversation where everybody goes, yeah, I am a bit of a perfectionist, or yeah, I like to please people, or yeah, my reactive tendency, yeah, I do sort of stand back off this. And that lowers the waterline together safely to say, look, you're all You all do things differently. We always talk about strengths. Everything's a strength, not because we're trying to be Pollyanna about it, but everything is a strength. It's just you overuse a strength in a particular way. So I always talk about 2-year-olds. So anyone who's got kids usually have a child that will go around 1 to 2, will go what I call the why phase. And the why phase is the question is why to everything. Why is the sky blue? Why are the clouds up? Why are they white? Why are they moving? Why are they fluffy? Why are they this? Why are they that? And by the time you get to the 20th why, you're frustrated and you want to clip them over the ear and go, will you shut up? I don't have children, as you can tell. I'm sure it doesn't work like that. But do you want to kill the strength that they're using, which is curiosity? And the answer is no, you don't. What you want to do is you want to help them figure out how to use that in a way that gets the result they want.
If we jump into that aspect around curiosity, because I love that connection of our strengths and curiosity. So yes, there's a shadow side to everything, mm-hmm. But when you think of tapping into conversation to allow curiosity to create that space to explore, are there things or questions that you find most helpful to remove our barriers and defensiveness and allow us to be curious in the face of feedback and things that might be hard to swallow?
So there are questions you can ask. Really, you're looking to recover missing information. So someone might say something like, I never do that. You go, never? Or I always something. You go,
those very
always?
Definite kind of, yeah.
And you're listening for little words that you kind of go, okay, that's interesting. What causes you to choose to say that? And people go, I don't choose that. You go, really? That's interesting. So tell me how to do you. How do I do you in a certain conversation? Teach me. How's it work? And once we start unpicking this, it gets really interesting. So I'll ask questions like, so what wouldn't happen if you didn't? What would happen if you did? What would happen if you didn't? And then we throw the double negative in, which is what wouldn't happen if you didn't? And people go, I don't understand that question. And I go, great, let me ask it again. And then what that does is it forces new thinking, because people just haven't got the neural connections. They've just not used them before.
And forgotten that whole aspect of by framing something as not a choice. They're forgetting. Yeah.
It's such a key word, because the assumption is that people can't, and people have all the resources they need. And people say, oh, what do you do to teams? And the answer is, I don't do anything. I get them to think and make connections and reconnect to resources that already exist that either they've never used before or they've just simply forgotten. Yeah. Classic example, I'm not confident. And I usually say, I bet you are. They say, no, I'm not. I go, okay, do you remember when you were a young child and you probably just learnt to walk in your carer's or your parents' house? Can you think back to a time when you used to run around buck naked going, look at me, all this stuff? And you go, and I just ask the question, at that moment in time, were you confident or not confident? And of course, the answer is confident, because you have that childlike.
Yeah, oblivious, no care in the world.
And that's it. And I go, so I'm not encouraging you to run around the office naked, but I am encouraging you to reconnect to that joy of something that you clearly have as a resource. You're just in this particular context, moment, not connecting to it. What causes you to choose not to connect to it?
And you know what's interesting, and this is always the way with any of these aspects of opening our minds or thinking differently, looking from a different perspective. But when you talk about that element of how it plays out and then asking the questions in a different way and having people kind of have the aha moment of like, oh, there's actually a completely different outcome I will achieve by not doing something, or it not being present, or this experience not being felt by my team. Like, I think that when we transfer that over then more broadly into, oh, how do we think about our interactions with customers? How do we think about the way we work with a client? And the same questions, it's this fractal nature of anything like this, isn't it? Where I often find it interesting when I'm doing business modeling with an organization and you're trying to talk about value propositions or what the competition is, and people fail to realize someone can choose to do nothing. You might think this is a problem that they must solve, but it is a choice that they can make whether to engage with you or not. It's not a given, and so I think these pieces, when I think of your framing around uncommon conversations, when you talk about how this leads to those better results within our team and performance and our own leadership, all of it is that expansion out from realizing something, learning to look at it differently, and then figuring out the other spaces in your work or life or leadership where that could be a useful skill to have.
Or just looking at situations where you have a skill in a certain context. People will say things like, "Oh, I'm bored at work. My job is this. It's dull. I'm not challenged anymore." And you go, "So when are you challenged? When do you feel alive?" And you go, "Oh, well, I do motocross, or I go on bikes in the countryside." I get the adrenaline thing, and I go, "So how would it be to bring that feeling into the role that you're doing? Well, what would you have to do?" And they go, "Oh, don't know about that." And I go, so show me what it's like when you feel alive on your bike, and they'll strax and pose or posture, or they'll change their body position. And you go, so now think about the thing that isn't exciting you, but use the same body position. And they go, "That's so weird." And you go, welcome to your biology.
Yeah, that's right. And because we're not making those connections and going, "Oh, I'm feeling that way because I'm slouched over and there's no natural sunlight and I haven't walked." But, it's like, oh, I can actually influence and shape those things. Yeah. Yeah.
You can. And therefore it's opening up these different experiences and finding ways to do that one-to-one to begin with, and then to try and use that and say, who else experienced this? Or playing devil's advocate in a collective situation, saying, modeling the way and saying, is anyone else bored? Because I'm bored.
Yeah.
I'm bored because we've been talking over what's going on here. We've been talking about this for the last 15 minutes. Can I invite you to play for the next 2 minutes? Just play doing something different. All change seats and now stand up and now talk about what it is. And it just changes ever so slightly, but it changes.
And it's interesting because they're almost, you mentioned before that you'll often do a game or something, and it can seem like there's this one level of what that is, but there's a deeper aspect. And I think much of that playfulness or tapping into curiosity, all of those elements, so often the very people who we want to have the most open minds to push boundaries, to think of new solutions and take the vision of a company forward, are the exact people who, through all of the elements you spoke about of identity and how they want to be perceived, how they perceive themselves, all of these pieces have actually continually shut down and given them a smaller space to play in.
They play out in a way that's really dysfunctional. A certain person says, I'm much more attractive than this other person. And you go, hang on a minute, you're standing for the most powerful office. But it's fascinating in terms of, because in my mind, I'm thinking, what on earth happened to you in your journey to now that causes you to feel the need to express something that, for the most part, I like to think most people would at least scratch their heads and go, "Oh, no, that was an odd thing to say."
Didn't realize that's what we were voting on, but yeah.
But it becomes really significant because then you're looking at, if you adopt the mindset of listening to what people say and say, okay, what causes you to say that? How does it serve you to say that? What benefit and payoff are you getting as a result of saying that and behaving that? Help me understand that. Because if I can give you the same benefit and payoff, but encourage you to change, what would prevent you from changing?
And these are then, I suppose, when you're going through these settings, at least in a executive or board or leadership kind of setting with a small group of people, where sometimes, certainly in my experience, and I'm guessing in yours, there are individuals where you hit a wall where either you realize, this is actually uncovering or exposing that there is a real disconnect between the group culture and what is acceptable here and a particular individual, where, because sometimes even when you go through that process, there isn't alignment, or someone says, that's just not how I want to engage or behave.
That can be cultural. At the beginning of the year, I coached a CEO who was who's Japanese national, for a Japanese company, an expat running the European organization based between the Netherlands and the UK. And his particular, we had the conversation in the room when we were doing the chemistry thing. And I was saying, look, we have to acknowledge that there's two different ways of looking at things here. There's your culture, and it's not wrong. It just is. And there's my way of looking at that. And there's for this to work, there has to be a translation or willingness to say, the way I interpret this, the meaning I give to it through my cultural lens is this. I'm anticipating you would see it differently through your lens. Help me understand that difference, and then look to how do we co-create a new piece of thinking that's helpful to you to move forward in this situation.
It's a fascinating point. And I think so often we don't even create the space to have really important conversations.
We don't know how to say it.
No, but when there's not even sort of the space created to have a conversation around what are the genuine core values and the mission and vision and all of the elements for the organization, we don't create enough space for that conversation. But then this piece is so important, because what I find is, through the lack of clarity that we have around ourselves as individuals and then the collective of the organisation, when we try to have the conversations, they either end up being very superficial and unhelpful, so they don't actually inform how we should behave or how we're expected to show up and interact, or they're very rigid and rule-based because it fails to accept, as you said, that there can be different ways of doing things, and just because we're saying this is how we, what we're prioritizing here, that means you're wrong if you culturally have a different opinion. So through not having the courage to be open and explore and curious of ourselves and us as a collective, the downside is just massive.
Simple example, when George Floyd was murdered, a great deal of upset and outcry and outrage. But in the organization I was working in at the time, we'd had a town hall meeting with an interim CEO who took it upon himself to say, does anybody want to express how they're feeling about this situation? On this call, open mic to the entire company. And you just go, that you really don't understand what's going on. And there's clearly one lens that you look through, not thinking about it's an international company. There's people on from different countries. There's people who have different perspectives on race, on the role of the police and society.
Yeah, and whose lived experience and sense of safety to even voice an opinion or the consequences of that opinion. We're not dealing with a level playing field. We often ask those questions from a place of being blind to our own privilege, I think, because we just assume that everybody else feels as safe as we do, or that if I say something controversial, the consequences of that are, someone will get a bit annoyed and that's it. And it's like, no, for others, it's actually a matter of physical safety and we just don't comprehend.
No, we don't comprehend. I remember a conversation I worked for. I took a role for one of the coaching professional bodies in the UK. Part of my agenda was the DEI conversation. It was to say, we need to move this agenda forward. Thought, this is interesting. I'm over 50, I'm white, I'm male, and you want me to lead that conversation. So we decided to run a series of circle conversations, just bring people into a circle, say what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, what's okay, what's not okay, and then have a conversation and see if anything came out that we could learn. First conversation, this question comes up. I'm 27, I'm British born, but my heritage isn't white Anglo-Saxon. And I'm under 30. What makes you think you can hold space for me? And I kind of went, whoa. And I was lucky enough to go, you're right, I can't. Not really. But someone's got to take the first step. There was a guy who was a senior manager, black, for a transport company. And he said something. I said to him, well, you didn't have to do that, whatever it was. And he said, I had no choice. And a light went on and I went, oh my God, I never even thought that you wouldn't have a choice. And it's just little nuanced things like that unless we have uncommon conversations to try and understand each other's perspectives.
Yeah.
And to to celebrate the differences, but to find the similarities, because they are there. And
in the spaces where we are that person who is trying to hold space or get a conversation happening, being very aware of, in the way that you've described, and there are people who do this really well, that you don't make it about you and you don't be defensive. And when someone has a reaction, you actually now have to really dial up and tune in to bringing all of the skills that you have to say, okay, where is this coming from? What is that about? How could I better set the scene? How could I better signal or model to others how this is going to play out? And then in the way that you described in that example, and when someone is brave enough to speak up and actually confront or call me on something, how do I, in the moment, behave in a way that sets a tone for where this is going to go, and make it clear who is welcome and invited.
But I think it's a useful example that says what triggers you, and then what conversations do you need to go and have with other people to go to work through that, so that next time you're in that, you've learned something, you've grown, and you can do it differently.
And even I think the ways that you stop yourself quicker, like as you learn and as you get put in those situations, you then tune in faster and go, okay, what could be some potentially small but important signals I could give, or ways I could, facilitate this conversation that demonstrate I wasn't just blundering in blind to my own privilege, so how do we set that? And I think you've described that. And we've done a bunch of, different experiments around this sort of stuff with Brad, my partner. And similar to the way you described yourself, he often says to me, oh, I feel that weight of, he's 61, 6'3", big, white man. It's like all the privilege aspects that are, when he walks into a room, taken for granted and have been his lived experience. But he is a deeply empathic, tuned in person. And so he has to very consciously figure out ways to make it clear that he is aware of that privilege. He does want to use his platform, but doesn't want to, take over space for other people by being that, the white savior complex of like, let me help you. It's a tricky one, isn't it?
It's really difficult. And I guess that comes to another point about working with teams, which is, if you assume you have the answer, I think you've made a misstep. I think our role is to bring the answer out. And I said to the team as we got going, I said, the answer's in the room. I said, I've worked for 20 years in consulting, and I have never failed to see an answer in the room, or at least in the room next door. Someone knows someone not too far away. You can just bring into the room and go, we're having this issue. And the person that produces the solution is often, or produces an idea, is often the person that you least expect. I was in a room in Munich with a team that were looking at e-commerce and marketing and CRM and sales. They were talking about this. They were an electrical retailer. And the solution to the technical problem was a suggestion from the most creative person in the room, who wasn't a technician. And everyone just went,
fresh perspective.
Wow.
Which I think is the perfect sort of way of bringing home this conversation around the fact that whether you take something like, you mentioned the having to hold that space around issues like diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's difficult conversations around our leadership styles and the consequences and flow-on impacts from our choices of language, all of those pieces, the very skill at the heart of what you've described, of being intentional, of being curious, of the not being defensive, all of those elements. When we bring those to any difficult conversation, we suddenly remove or at least reduce the risk of it becoming a token conversation where we say, oh, I will publicly talk about the need for diversity because that's something I have to tick that box of, like, everyone is required to do that. Or how do we have a female on the board, or what does that look like? And it becomes a ticker box exercise. When we approach it in the way you've described, not only is it a richer conversation, but this is the piece that I really passionately want leaders in our business setting to understand, is when it's done in a genuine way and really integrated into saying, what would the win-win be here? Unapologetically, we want it to be beneficial for the business, but it isn't about trying to tell a good story with no substance. It's saying when it's done well, when these conversations are had in a rich way, when there is that safety and curiosity, guess what? Actually, diversity in the room of all types, experience, backgrounds, any of those elements will bring fresh perspective, which in the current crazy market everyone's in, like that's what we need. You have to bring that. And so I think it's the putting the challenge out to leaders to see this, strip away some of those pieces where things are seen as soft skills or, the fluffy bits that you do on a retreat and you bring someone in and to genuinely say, yeah, you can do it at that level. But if you are, you're really just wasting money and time. How do we really start to shift the way we look at these conversations, that we look at our role as leaders, and bring back together some of that genuine wisdom and insight that should be present in our leaders and use that in a way that isn't just broadening the gap between those who have and those who don't, but is bringing the collective wisdom and insight and innovation to the table so that each organisation is actually contributing in a multitude of different ways.
Well, so one of my favourite proverbs is one figure can't lift a pebble. And we live in times where we need all hands, all fingers to deal with some of the really gnarly challenges that we face together. And only by being willing to have these kinds of, they're slower, they take time, they take investment, that some of them are difficult because you'll walk into walls and you'll bruise yourself and then you'll have to pick yourself up and go again. Mm-hmm. There'll be those who say it's soft and fluffy, which is why I like Leadership Circle, because I've got more data than you can shake a stick at.
Yeah.
And go,
yeah.
It's data informed. And then we get into, oh yeah, but that number, this number, that number, to which my response is, okay, if you're standing on a burning platform, are you going to measure the height of the flames, the heat of the flames, and the speed at which they're going across the platform, or are you going to get off the platform and then look at what's going on? And
which is the perfect example of making people go back to questioning. They think they're rational. They think they make decisions in a certain way. And you're like, you're doing this every day. Every day you're making choices about what you prioritize or where you spend money without actual data that is backing up that has a return on investment. So you do it in these areas unconsciously. We're saying, okay, broaden that out. Yeah.
Yeah. So these power skills are powerful. They are worth acquiring. People achieve in hours what normally takes months if there's that willingness and that courage to step forward and to model the way for others who may be skeptical, who may be scared as to what it's going to do, and try and take them on the journey together.
Yeah.
And those that don't want to go on the journey, give them the space and the dignity to make whatever choice it is for them and then support them in that choice.
I'm wondering, Paul, as we wrap up, are there areas in your own work and your business where you're hoping to crack into or make some kind of ripple or play a part in contribution that you haven't been able to crack yet? Is there sort of something that is pulling you forward? And if so, I'd love to know, what that vision is.
Yeah, I couldn't say no to a question like that, could I? But I think my best work is providing transformative growth experiences for women who lead, who've had enough of trying to squeeze into a skin that doesn't fit and are now ready to invest in themselves, to inhabit the skin that is uniquely theirs and to accomplish this from the inside out. And I think I've been doing some really interesting reading about how the story of history is written, who writes the history.
Yeah, the perspective of that, yeah.
As long as the story of the hunt is written by the hunter, not the lion, then you'll always have one perspective. And if you look at stories like early Christianity, if you look at stories like how the printing press contributed to subjugating women, my view is men have done an okay job, but we really need to get to a place where and it's coming. It is happening, and it's starting to happen a lot quicker, which is great. Where women are given a genuine seat at the table. You're not the token HR person because we don't like dealing with that emotional thing or difficult people. It's like you have something real and valuable to contribute. Where we create a support infrastructure in the work environment that deals with the fact that their parents, they're probably carers, they're probably dealing with, as they get to a certain point, they're dealing with perimenopause, they're dealing with menopause, all that stuff that we just sweep under the carpet right now because the the data is compelling when we have diverse communities of leaders working together. And I'm not being all PC about that.
No,
The
yeah, I
more
understand.
diverse, the better the financial results, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But more to the point, we make better decisions to be better ancestors to future generations. And we as the baby boomer generation, well, me certainly, I feel I have a responsibility to try and contribute to that in some way. So I want to work with women who are either preparing for or entering in or currently in their fifth decade. They've reached the point where they kind of go, this doesn't fit. I'm tired of trying to fit in, and something else is speaking to me. Help me make the transition from A to B, wherever A is and wherever B is.
Yeah. And can I ask on that, have you found in all of the work you've done and working in these leadership groups or supporting leaders, have you found that the internal kind of champion or advocate in organizations, or the people that push into these spaces that you've talked to us about today, are more likely to be women than men? Like, is there more curiosity and appetite there?
I think appetite is broad, and I think it's difficult to generalize. I think it's very unique and specific to specific contexts.
Okay.
And I
Well, that's
think
good. That's good to hear, because that hasn't always been the case. You know, many people, when I've
no,
spoken to them, there has still been almost gendered responses to what's valued, who then runs that conversation, who participates. So that's good to hear that you're finding a broad engagement.
I'm finding a broader church. You are still getting glass ceilings in certain types of organizations. You're still getting bro culture that keeps women on the outside. But it's very simple. You know, I talk about the England football teams, the soccer teams. And as you know, the Lionesses won the European Championship. And there was this spate of things on Facebook that was hilarious, which was like, yeah, if you want a job done, get the women to do it. And, but there, you know, we need to invest in women. We look at how female founders are treated, the proportion of founders that are funded.
The funding, oh gosh, yeah. Yeah.
And how that plays out. And you go, we need to open those gates. And there's some of that. I always remember when I was in consulting, so it's kind of like the career path is go and be a partner. You know, that's the ladder. And I was very privileged to be invited to take part in one of the first part in the training that sort of prepared the ground for this is what happens, this is how you prepare a case, and these are the things you've got to do, and this is what it's like being a partner. And I looked at it and I went, if that's great, I don't want it. And of course, then I'm a consultant sat in an organization where everybody's going, I want to be a partner. I'm going,
Yeah,
I
that's
don't.
the assumed path. Yeah.
Yeah, you just, and then of course, then it became really difficult to try and find, well, you have to reconcile how you feel and you don't fit in and you're the black sheep and all that kind of stuff. And the opportunities don't happen. And it was like, so I ended up where I needed to be, which is great.
Yeah. Well,
But we need,
and from that experience, we're able to bring an understanding that you wouldn't have otherwise had, which I think is important.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. So I want to do that for others.
I love that. I think that's wonderful, and something that we need. And I think if people like yourself and me and all of us doing this work can stick at just, you know, chipping away at those things, the reality is, I deeply believe that even starting to equip people in the way that you've described today, that makes them tune into, oh, I wasn't conscious of that before. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, translate into the very work that you're wanting to have more impact in. Because if more leaders started to realize that their experience of the world or of an organization or of being in a position of authority is not the same as someone else's, and there were other barriers or other reasons why someone might need to be engaged with differently, not to do them a favor or because they're not as talented or don't have the same potential. So it's not about sort of putting cotton wool around people and who don't deserve a role, but it's acknowledging that there were things at play that created a benefit for you that you weren't aware of and gave you privilege and opportunity, or at least safety to be brave, that someone else didn't have. And so those skills, again, as we let them ripple out and as we start to, as leaders, tune into I've learnt something over here. Where could that add value in a different space? I think that's where we will see that change happen. Thank you so much, Paul. If people want to follow some of your thinking and what you're writing, or check out your work, where is the best place? Where would you like people to go? And we can share that detail.
Thank you. So I write on Substack. My Substack's called the Pocket Dojo. There you'll find articles, and we also run a podcast called the Pocket Dojo, and we try really hard to think. We try to be a voice rather than an echo, and offer material that might just make people think differently. And then if people want to connect, you'll find me on LinkedIn if you'd like to have a conversation. I'd love to do that.
Great. I encourage people to connect with Paul. We'll share the links to the podcast and to the Substack. And thank you again,
Bessi.
Paul. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for being so generous.
My pleasure.